Hello and welcome to the Education Connections webinar, Preparing English Learners to Meet College and Career Readiness Standards, 4 Key Uses of Academic Language. We are delighted to be joined this evening by two guest experts, Dr. Mariana Castro and Dr. Ruslana Westerlund, from the Academic Language and Literacy Initiatives at WIDA. My name is Lindsay Massoud and I will be moderating tonight's session. I want to extend a very warm welcome to everyone who's been able to join us. Just one moment, we are making sure that you can see our screen. Hang on, sorry about that. All right. All good. Sorry about that, everyone. Just a little technical glitch and we'll get right going. So I just wanted to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this evening for our very first Education Connections evening webinar and our first live event of the 2015-2016 school year. We're happy to see familiar names of some of our Education Connections members and really delighted to see all of you new participants as well. We're so glad you could join us. We'll also mention really quick, if you would like to see the handouts from tonight, we have 2 handouts that we've attached to the webinar, and those are a PDF of the PowerPoint and also a transcript from a video that you will see later on in the presentation. So we'll begin tonight's session with a brief introduction, including an overview of Education Connections, and then we'll hear from Dr. Castro and Dr. Westerlund. Following and throughout their presentation, we'll have time reserved for questions and comments from all of you. We'll be monitoring those as they come in, and we encourage you to send along any thoughts or questions that come to mind during the presentation using the questions box in the GoToWebinar window. During tonight's session, we'll also be posting some polling questions related to your background, and once results are in, we'll post them for you to view. At the end of the Q&A, we'll briefly wrap up and remind you of ways to continue the conversation that we start tonight. We'll also be doing, in addition to some interactive activities in this webinar, we also invite you to chat further with us about tonight's topic by joining us on Twitter. You can use the hashtag EdConnects, EDCONX, to participate in the conversation with Education Connection staff and your fellow educators. For those of you who may be new to Education Connections, we wanted to briefly introduce you to the community and resources available. Education Connections is an initiative of the Center for Applied Linguistics in collaboration with the University of Oregon. It is hosted on the University of Oregon's Obaverse platform. It's a free online community providing access to a wide range of resources and bringing educators together to collaborate around implementing high-quality, standards-based instruction with all students and especially English learner students. There are many different ways to participate in Education Connections. In addition to live events such as this one, you can share ideas and ask questions in discussion forums, find resources to use in your classroom, and read Tuesday's tips and Friday's fun facts that are shared in our forums every week. Anyone is welcome to join, so we invite you to sign up today if you're not already a member. As a reminder, the Education Connections team will post a video archive of the webinar, a PDF of the PowerPoint, and links to resources related to today's session. To access these resources, log on to Education Connections and click on the Live Events tab. On your screen, you'll see a few polling questions regarding your background. We'll post these results as they come in. So first, just let us know a little bit about what grade levels you primarily work with. Do you work in elementary school, middle school, high school, post-secondary, or is this not applicable to you? Okay, so we're actually pretty evenly distributed across. We have about a quarter from elementary school, 15% middle school, 21% high school, and 15% post-secondary. So yeah, we have a lot of people from across the grade level spectrum. That's great. So now, if you could respond, what is your current position? Are you a content or general education teacher, an ELL or ESOL teacher, a bilingual teacher, a school administrator, or do you have some other kind of role? Okay, so we have about half of our folks are ELL, ESOL teachers or in some other role, perhaps outside of schools. And we do have a good percentage of both content and or general education teachers and administrators as well. That's great. All right, one last one just to get a sense of the context in which you all are working. So if you work at a school, what kinds of supports does your school or institution offer to English learners? Counseling, sheltered instruction in the classroom, self-contained ESL, push-in or pull-out ESL, and native language supports. Okay, so we have a lot of people whose schools provide push-in or pull-out ESL, a little bit less who provide sheltered instruction or self-contained ESL, and fewer that provide counseling as well as a kind of support. So that's great. We have a little bit of a better sense of some of the contexts and roles that are represented among our audience tonight, so that's great. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Castro and Dr. Westerlund. Remember to submit your questions throughout. And actually, let's see. Okay, so we'll turn it over to you all.
Okay, hello everyone. Rosanna and I are part of WIDA, and I realize many of you may belong to a state that is part of the WIDA consortium. However, many of you may not have even heard of WIDA. As a brief introduction to WIDA, I want to share that we are an organization housed at the Wisconsin Center for Education Research, which is part of the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. WIDA has worked on understanding the language demands of content standards over the last 10 years, as well as developing language standards to scaffold the language development of children who are learning English as an additional language. With the recent development and enhancements of College and Career Readiness standards, WIDA continues to enhance language standards to guide educators in addressing these needs. Currently, WIDA standards have been adopted in over 37 states and territories, where language learners are also assessed annually by the Access for ELLs, which is WIDA's assessment of language development. If you have any questions about WIDA, you can find more information by going to www.wida.us. So as we begin our discussion, I want to share with you a quote from Noam Chomsky. As you read this quote, what does this mean to you? Let's take a minute to read the quote. So at this point, please use the question section to share with us what this quote means to you. Why is it important in the work you do? Why do you think we would begin with this particular quote today? So here's one person talked about language being generative, which means you can create infinite utterances with a finite set of components. And that is the magic of language. Thank you. Hannah Prashker talked about language being used in different ways for different uses. We also have people talking about language not being fixed but dynamic. We need to ensure that our students understand the principles of language. Someone commented about the various and infinite ways we have of communicating across the globe, and yet rules exist within smaller regions. Students have to learn about language, and language evolves as people interact from different backgrounds and bring new words to situations. So I think it's very important to remember that there are rules for language, and students may learn these rules, but because language's interpretation and use is created by those in the spaces where language is used, the way one understands or shares ideas and concepts is also ever-changing. If we only think at the most concrete level and focus on the rules of language, we're missing the most important function of language, its use in communication. Therefore, in addition to learning the words and rules, which are important, we also need to think about how language is used and make this knowledge explicit to our language learners. So now I would like to shift our perspective. Let's think a little bit more about language learners and those that you have in your class, and why is this relevant to their learning. So as we are thinking about language learners, we need to think about every context. In every context, language learners use language to communicate. Its use is created and recreated by those who are in those spaces, which means not just students, but their peers, teachers, other adults. Then when they learn something new, that makes sense in that context, but it's not as easy to recontextualize or transfer it to a different context, because language use may be different here, and there may be different people there as well. So while these ideas about language use are abstract, today what we will focus is on their application. So there are two questions we will discuss and try to answer with you, along with you. The first one is about what language do students need to access college and career readiness standards. But it's not just what language, but also how is language used. And then how can we create opportunities for our language learners to learn and use that language? So let's start with the first question. I have pictures here of some of the college and career readiness standards. The expectations of these standards have increased the demand of language proficiency. So if you think about it, as content standards focus more on creating and critiquing and engaging with various concepts and practices, the language required to do so becomes critical for meaningful participation of language learners. So what I did is I picked one particular standard. This is a standard from Common Core Mathematics, and notice what the standard says. It says, explain equivalence of fractions in special cases and compare fractions by reasoning about their size. So this is the content, the concept that we want children to learn. So let's think about language. What do we want students to do with language? So here is an example. Explain the equivalence of these two fractions. So this is an example that would be related to the content standard that we just saw. It says 1/2 equals 2/4. Now, right now I'm not asking learners to come up with an answer, correct? I'm really asking them how they got that answer. But why are these two numbers equivalent? So what is the language that we need to do this? I would like to invite you to use the question box, and I know some of you were not sure about where to put your responses. if you look at on the right part of your screen, there is a word questions, and just to remind you, you can write the questions and we'll answer them, but you won't be able to see the questions from others. I know some people were wondering how to do that, and unfortunately we can't do that through the question. So it's going to be one way. If you could help me out right now by thinking about what is the language that students need in order to explain the equivalence of these two fractions, 1/2 and 2/4. So we have someone who is talking about the words part to whole. So we could talk about the word part, and again, it's not just about the word itself, but how the word part has a particular meaning here. So one part, 1/2 is what part of a whole. And someone else mentioned, how about understanding the word equivalence? What does equivalence mean? How is it related to the word equal? Students need to be able to understand and explain equivalence and fractions. Or students need to know how to use the sentence frame with because. So this idea of creating compound sentences, right? And you know, linking them through this connecting word because. Learners need to understand the language of math. What does equivalence mean? And what are we talking about when we discuss fractions? And this is very interesting because we've been talking for a long time about academic language as if it's a different type of language, but it's really how we're using language within the context of math. So you're not learning a whole new set of rules about language, but you're thinking more about the context. Someone wrote an example. They are equivalent because, and then they're talking about nominator and denominator, same as. So these are types of, again, to know what nominator and denominator are is just at the word level. But then at the sentence level, learning some frames like they are equivalent because, or using words like same as. So let's look at another example. This example comes from the Virginia Standards of Learning, and it says participate in, collaborate in, and report on small group learning activities. So let's think about what is the language that children need to interact in a small group. How do children use language when they're talking to peers? For what particular purposes? So can you think of examples of language that they may need in order to engage in a small group? And help me by sharing those ideas again. Great examples coming in. Gina talked about agreement, disagreement, comparing, contrasting, initiating conversation as I think that, or asking for more clarification, like how did you come to this conclusion? Sentences that might start with my opinion is, or going beyond agreement and saying I agree with you because, or I have a different idea, or what about, we could, we should, I think, agree. So all these things, asking questions, asking for other people, inviting other people into the conversation. What do you think? The language of turn-taking, how to extend on another's thoughts or statements. Someone talked about this idea of mortar words. So even though in this case we're talking about instructional language, there will be certain ways that we always use when we're working in a small group. And if this were to be in the context of a math discussion, we might be using language, the language of math, but we would also be using this instructional language. Ideas as to how to be an active listener. Or I think she mentioned, he said, so using this indirect speech, having learners the learners need to know how to use pronouns, conventions of conversation style, etc. So as you can see, language has been used for two different purposes in each of these examples. So in one, they were really explaining, and in the other one, in this particular example, we're asking students to discuss. So how many different purposes for language use are there? Their answer is that there are many different purposes of language use. But what we have done at WIDA in collaboration with our peers at the Center for Applied Linguistics and some other national experts is to focus on a smaller number of these key uses, which Ruslana will discuss now.
In the previous slides, we have examined a couple of examples of language required to access the College and Career Readiness standards. At WIDA, we have identified 4 high-leverage key language uses: recount, explain, argue, and discuss. Is this the complete list of ways how students use language in school? Of course not. There are many other ways in which students use language. These 4 key uses of language can be found in every discipline. Let's explore one by one. As teachers, we know our disciplines and we know our content well. Like does not recognize the water in which it swims. It's hard for teachers, unless you have language training, to recognize the language used in our disciplines. We invite you to jump out with us and see the water in which we swim. We invite you to recognize the language that you use on a daily basis. Let's try to make the invisible visible. First, let's take a look at the key use of argue. Generally, arguments include a claim or an opinion in younger grades, reasons, facts, evidence, claims, counterclaims. Some arguments include a counterclaim at the end, and there is a summing up of the position or call to action. These are the main content pieces of the argument, which you as teachers may know really well. Let's take a look at the language that is needed to construct and develop an argument. We will play a short video and ask you to jot down notes about what language you hear that is specific to argument. Don't worry if you don't capture everything. We will deconstruct it together. And you can use the handouts at this point of the video transcript. We will play only about 1.5 minutes, and you should have that transcript in the handouts.
Hi everybody, I'm Dee, and this is my persuasive speech. So I'm sure everyone has heard a little bit about the controversy of cell phones in schools. When I was in high school, cell phones were a part of everyday life, and it seemed that everybody had a cell phone. In a study done by Obringer and Coffey, they stated the expansion of cell phones during the past decade has made it commonplace for students and teachers to have cell phones in the school setting. Data from 2014 indicated that 58% of 6th through 12th graders have a cell phone, and 68% of students regularly bring their cell phone to school. The number of cell phones in the United States rose from 1.2 million in 1987 to 145 million in 2002. And that was almost 10 years ago. Cell phones in school is such a controversial issue because you have people who see the benefits of cell phones, but you also have people who see the negative effects. One of the main reasons why parents give their kids cell phones is to keep in touch with them. Based on a small qualitative study, S. Charles said, almost all participants discuss communication with parents as a part of everyday usage. Many parents agree to get cell phones for their teens in order to improve contact with them. We live in a very fast-paced world, and without cell phones, it would make keeping in touch with parents very difficult for the students.
So now take a couple of minutes and, looking at the language of the transcript provided for you, jot down some language structures that this particular student used to make her claim, provide reasons, state evidence, and support her thinking. And then we will discuss the language together. So some examples are coming in. Benefits of cell phones in schools, data indicated. Data use of statistical language, numeric values, studies show, communication with parents, studies stated, negative effects of cell phones, 4 counterclaims. In a study done by, one of the main reasons, statistical reference. Wonderful. You have generated a great list. Here are that you actually have named. I have also identified on the screen. There are, these are the particular features that we have focused on, but there were many more, definitely. Evaluative language, such as important, rampant, critical, essential, vital, obvious, was used to send the message of importance of cell phone use in schools. Words like should, must, or have to were used to call to action and create a sense of urgency. If you know, and many of you noticed in the chat box, she didn't say, she used statistical language and factual language instead of, I think we should use cell phones in school. She used factual language to make her opinion sound like a fact. Cell phones should be allowed in school instead of, I think cell phones should be allowed in school. Also, language that cites studies, that many of you refer to that. They present a neutral stance and present opinions as facts. Data indicates, studies showed. Also, the student used connectives, therefore, because of that, to draw a conclusion. And did you notice which audience the student was trying to appeal to, adults or peers? So definitely the audience played a key role in the language choices this particular student made in the video. So with this, we will move on to the next key use. And when students explain, they provide an explanation of a natural phenomena such as erosion or lunar eclipse, or how system works, such as how the government works or how an ecosystem works. In explanations, students are expected to identify causal or conditional relationships in causal explanations. They need to compare and contrast ideas. All of these uses require specific structures, specific uses of language. Let's take a look at an example of an explanation in younger grades. This video will be brief. We don't have a transcript for it. So just jot down quickly what you hear.
Evaporation is when water from a puddle goes up into the sky. Condensation is the third step in the water cycle. Condensation is when the water from the sky goes into a cloud. The fourth step in the water cycle is precipitation. Precipitation is when it rains. Then it goes over and over and over again. By Chloe and Maya.
Oh, that was fun. Great artwork. So that was an example of a cyclical explanation. So if you were able to capture some of their language that they used, I will read the examples that you share. Happens when, steps of a cycle, language of the cycles. Yes, this was a cyclical explanation, and so there was particular language that was used in that. definition, defining key terms with an illustration, and giving definitions of scientific terms. Yes, in this water cycle video, you named technical terms, and children used words like condensation, evaporation, precipitation. We call those words nominalization. It's when nominalization is used to pack an entire process of what happens to water or a complex concept into one word. So I'm going to show you more examples of other types of explanations that you didn't hear in the video, just so we can unpack explanation a little more. But this one, in this case, technical terms are used in explaining a phenomenon of the lunar eclipse. And technical terms usually are the easiest for teachers to identify because they are those bolded vocabulary words. However, the difficulty of academic language is related not simply to unfamiliar vocabulary, but to the way the language is structured. For example, the use of nominalizations and complex noun groups that condense information to make it impossible to be more precise or concise. So look at this example of complex noun groups. It adds precision. Instead of just saying, I saw an eclipse, to add more precision, you would need to say total lunar eclipse. Passive voice is also used in scientific explanations to a much higher degree than in other content areas. If you teach language arts, you know that passive voice is usually discouraged. However, in science, passive voice is very common. Look at this example of passive voice. The light from the sun is blocked. The content area of science has its own way of encoding knowledge, and it's important to teach children how particular content areas and which structures they use to communicate information in that particular content area. In addition to the content area, the audience, the relationship of the speaker and the listener determine the language use. For example, a couple weeks ago when we were able to see the lunar eclipse, I asked my son to explain the phenomenon. His language was less technical and supported by multi-semiotic resources, such as using his brother to be the earth and his dad to be the moon, as well as hand motions to accompany his explanation. If the audience is peers or family members, the use of language is typically non-technical. If the audience is adults and the modality is writing, then it requires a more technical use of language. And subjects without personal pronouns, such as lunar eclipse, can be viewed from anywhere on the right side of the earth, on the night side of the earth, versus I can view the lunar eclipse, if you rewrite it to active voice. So the language of schooling is complex and thus need to be made visible so that students can use it effectively to be empowered language users. Now Mariana will take us to the next key use, recount.
So narratives are very common in primary grades. Just think of kindergartners. The focus is on beginning, middle, and end. However, as children mature, so do the expectations for language. Language using narratives can become quite complicated. Language as its most basic use in recounts can serve to describe. And then as it becomes more complicated, authors use language in very specific ways as an aesthetic element. And as a matter of fact, the nature and quantity of the unique words or phrases in narratives is astounding. I am using the word unique to describe words that go beyond the core vocabulary. So as you read novels, you may come up with a lot of unique words that you may not see for a couple other books that you read. It's also common to use semiotic clusters for description. Think of the different language we can use around communication. For example, to say someone communicates, we would use say, tell, announce, warn, whisper. And each word, even though it's about communication, has a different nuanced meaning from the other. Similar when we talk about action. We can talk about motion, nudged, touched, pushed. All these are words about action, but again, each word has a very specific and nuanced meaning. So what I would like to do now is look at this excerpt from a longer narrative. instead of a video, we're going to have this particular piece of writing. And it's about the horrible day. And you don't have the whole, the whole writing. As I mentioned, this is an excerpt. And it says, one morning, I woke up and I was turned around on my bed. Then I fell off. I walked downstairs and I almost fell over my dog. Next, I fell asleep in my cereal and my brother stole my toast. Then I had to walk to school because our car ran out of gas. I was late for school and I got stuck outside in the rain. Guess what? I really didn't like this day at all. So in this case, what language do you see? Now, notice that this particular story might be from a student who might be in an earlier grade. So we might be a little tempted to talk about the things that the student either didn't do well or forgot to do. But what I would like for you to help me focus is on the words and language that he actually used. So this is great. A lot of you are talking about the sequence words, about those connecting words. Phrasal words, fell off, fell over, fell asleep, those great collocations. And then the sequencing words like then, next. And that's true. As a student is recounting their day, it's usually in past tense. There's also some words that you notice, like one morning. In that way, he's announcing to the reader that this is a story, right? Look at the past tense throughout this piece. Look at the connectors. They help hold the writing together. Words like then. So what about the audience? What about the register? Had this been a more formal document, had this been a letter, had this been a journal, the way this language would have been used would be different. And Daria also mentioned the compound sentences. Donna talked about a good sense of voice, very comfortable in the register. So let's think about generalizing a little bit. And remember, we're just giving you some examples but there are many, many, many more examples. So a lot of people talked about the past tense. Early one morning, I woke up and, or sequencing language. There were like 5, 6 different people who talked about this sequencing language. And verb phrases with adverbs to add detail. So it's not just reading, but reading quietly. Thinking, saying, feeling, consider, yelled, loved, ignore. There's a lot of personal pronouns, and every time you see a personal pronoun, the student has to go back and figure out what this personal pronoun is referring to. Who are they referring to? And there's also some embedded clauses that make the sentences more complex, like Maria, who was an amazing dancer, wanted to be my partner. Now, this is, of course, not part of the writing, but I was just trying to give you an example, and I wanted to talk about dancing. Of course. So the last key use is discuss. Now, this particular use involved many discussions at WIDA and with Cal, and because it is not typically considered when discussing genres. But the reason we chose to keep it is because of the opportunity it provides us to highlight the importance of interaction in learning. Oral language is the basis for literacy development. I think we can all agree on that. So for language learners, it provides opportunities for them to apply their knowledge about language and to learn more language through interactions with others. Therefore, we believe that to discuss is not only an important use of language, but for language learners, it is critical in their language development. So Ruth created this graph about the importance of academic conversations. When language learners often engage in social exchanges as educators, we can provide them with opportunities to develop language to engage also in academic conversations. This slide shows what to do with language during these academic conversations. So can you imagine what language is typically used to clarify ideas, for example? Or what might you say as an educator to clarify what your student said? or to rephrase what your students said. And what if you're having a discussion with a colleague? How might you ask to clarify the idea? So we did identify some of these uses in some of the examples that we were giving before. For example, when we were talking about small groups, inviting others to participate, listen with a purpose. I know that many times we discuss and we're already thinking of what we're going to say, but learning to negotiate ideas, to provide and receive constructive feedback. All of these uses are very important, but they are not always explicitly talked about.
So now we will talk very briefly about our second question. How can I help my students who are language learners use this language? Here are some examples of supporting language development of your students. English language learners need language models and need opportunities to work with non-ELs. So grouping them always with ELs or always with their same level of language development might not be beneficial, but exposing them to models of language use in various ways is great for their conversational skills and language development. English learners learn language best when it's meaningful to them. Therefore, teachers need to teach language in meaningful activities and for meaningful and authentic purposes. Not necessarily reducing language to a set of rules, but using language for authentic purpose in communication in whatever activities they're doing. Sentence frames or sentence starters can be used as a springboard or so-called a running start to help ELs organize their thoughts in meaningful conversations. There are a lot of benefits to sentence frames, and there are also a lot of caveats. And some of them are that they need to be really used as a springboard and not necessarily try to, as WIDA says it, sentence stemify every student response. Some ELs who have used sentence starters have commented that it helped them organize their thinking and put their thoughts on to get their thoughts together. But then the rest of the language was really more fluid and natural and authentic in use, but not necessarily sentence stemified all the way to the end. I would also encourage you to work with your students for students to create their sentence frames once they become more comfortable depending on their levels of language development.
Dr. Westerlund,
yes.
I have a question for you.
Okay.
Actually, it's a question from Rana. Could you give us some examples of sentence frames that you would use?
Well, great question. For example, it depends on the purpose of communication. So if you say, let's say we are in 6th grade and we're writing an argument. So then if you choose your audience, you choose your topic, and if you need a sentence frame for a claim, then you would give one such as cell phones should be allowed in school, and then if you want students to do a counterclaim, then you can give them sentence starters that start with, on the other hand, there are negative effects, or however, it really kind of depends on what you want your students to do with those sentence frames to use what is that main purpose. And that's why thinking about the key use of language is the first organizing feature when you create any supports that you want to give to your students.
You know, I remember Virginia, the state of Virginia has a wonderful set of very short videos about language functions. And in the one about social studies, there is a teacher who shows how to write a paragraph for comparing and contrasting. And she uses language frames. And in this case, the language frames help students move away from typical connectors like and or. And she tells them, okay, you need to put in, if you have, she walks them first through a graphic organizer like a Venn diagram, and then talks about the different parts of the Venn diagram and how things that are in common, they could use and, but they could also use as well as. So a sentence frame really has like the blank parts and then it has a part that is given to the student. And ideally, is a particular word that the student is not familiar with. So the student, if the student already knows how to say, oh, but, I agree with you, but, then you would add a new one like however. But the sentence frames helps them explain the structure of the sentence. And eventually they might, claim that or appropriate that particular frame and start using it independently.
Great. Thank you for that question. And we have provided some resources for you that we have consulted ourselves in preparation of this presentation, and some of them focus more. The one by Maria Brisk is really about genre-based pedagogy in elementary schools. It really does focus on key uses of argue, explain, recount, and others. So that's a helpful one by Maria Brisk. And Zweer's Common Core in diverse classrooms really focuses on creating and setting up successful and facilitating successful conversations in classrooms. And he covers grade levels like grade 3 through 12. And one of teacher favorite books by Pauline Gibbons is also a very useful resource that uses similar language theory of looking at language through the genre lens and supporting teachers to grow in that area of knowledge of language. It really is, the audience of that book is content teachers, so it's very accessible and an excellent resource.
Yeah, I wanted to mention there's another question about are sentence frames, sentence starters, sentence stems, are those all these synonyms? And do you want...
Yes, different people call them different things, but basically they are chunks of language that get students to sort of like a springboard to a conversation or to a writing piece. Mm-hmm. So yeah, different people call them different things.
And sentence starters and sentence stems might be those wording that are at the beginning of a sentence, whereas sometimes sentence frames can be used more, can include sentence starters, but may also include the actual sentence frame. For example, for a compound sentence, oh, yes. You might have a sentence and then the chunk of language might be in the middle, or the chunk of language might be at the end. So I think it's not as important the name as to thinking about what kind of supports we can provide students so that they can be adding continuously to the repertoire. Mm-hmm. Someone else
gave examples.
And some people gave examples. There's another interesting question here from an instructional coach. How can I help my elementary math teachers understand how to help ELLs with math word problems? And I'm thinking that in this case, the first thing that when students are learning language is to really identify language that is this instructional language. Someone else talked about these motor words. There are several patterns about language that are typically used in word problems. Typically, students are not given just a variety of word problems, but if they're thinking about fractions, they might all have certain things in common. Or if they're talking about multiplication, they may all have certain language in common. So helping children first recognize that language, and sometimes, like we say, let's not focus on just words, but chunks of language. So what language might be key for me to give me an idea about relationships between numbers or what I'm looking for? Do you have other?
Yeah, just to reiterate that the language of math in word problems really is more complex than just particular vocabulary words that are like add or subtract or total or sum up, but how the sentence is structured in a particular word problem can help teachers understand the complexity of language that the children need to unpack that's in front of them to get to math.
Mm-hmm. And I think that it's the important thing about math is we always talk about explicit instruction. It does not mean direct instruction, but really thinking as Ruslana talked a lot about meaningful, authentic ways. So when you're reading math, when you're doing math problems, that is an authentic situation. They're really trying to solve that mathematical problem. So thinking about how to decode, how to unpack the meaning and really highlighting words. Sometimes there are some techniques that are used in literacy that, of course, when you're talking about the content of math might not be appropriate. But when you're actually illuminating or highlighting the language of math, you might want to bring up. And that's when I'm talking about particular patterns. So, so things like a number less than or the square of. So bringing those up would be really useful for students because then they can recontextualize those. Okay, and Donna Webb just shared that at her school, they have created a language of math poster for 6th, 7th, and 8th grades, which helps students identify specific terms like for addition and subtraction, so synonyms, and those have been very successful. I think all these tools are always wonderful, especially when you co-create them with students, and students find new words to add. Just like we add for literacy at the beginning, language around sounds, we might want to create word walls about math, about terms for multiplication. But remember, I think that it's very easy to get stuck in the words. So the more you can provide chunks and examples of language use, it can be more helpful.
Someone asked for some resources for adult language learners preparing for higher education, and we can provide those on the website where the webinar will be posted.
And then there's another one about a new ELL from Greece who is struggling with math vocabulary even when using Google Translate. Not a math teacher, but reading strategies and decoding the words is helping a bit. Any other suggestions? I would really caution you again, about the use of Google Translate and any of those electronic translations. Some of the things you might want to do is, as an experiment, is you write something in English and it will give it to you in a different language, and then type that same stuff back into English and it gives you a total different translation. So the translations are really poor in some of these cases. But I think starting maybe like a math, their own math glossary, can put in examples of language that they see that is new to them. They can fill it in.
And I would also encourage to some of the math concepts, some of the math words actually pack a concept inside them. So to teach the concept using simpler language first is a more useful approach to beginning learners like your example. So instead of using complex language to teach the concept, using simple language to teach the concept and then attach a more technical terminology to it. And of course, it depends on the age, but the use of manipulatives and things that children can touch and play with to help learn that concept will be more useful than just having a lot of simple language thrown at them.
Okay, here's a great caution or caveat, and it talks about the caution about co-creating math vocabulary posters for terms is great, or I'm actually thinking about chunks of language, but examples with each term are critical. And I'm thinking that we don't just add them, but you really talk about their use. And they give a great example. For example, all together is not always addition. So you could say 3 boxes of 12 pencils. How many altogether? So that could lead to confusion. So that's what we're thinking, like in meaningful, authentic ways where you can actually deconstruct together. The more examples you do together, the more they learn, because what they need to learn is the process of unpacking that. Some people have talked about visuals and manipulatives to show, use maybe coins. And I think those are always great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, some of my students are confusing math when the teacher starts talking about finding X or R or A, B, C. The students ask why, and why does the teacher have letters mixed with numbers?
Yes. Yeah.
And this is very typical when you start talking about algebra and algebraic thinking, and helping students understand the difference between constant and variables in algebra is important. And I would say that that these are important conversations to have with the teacher, because this is more about math than just language. Getting the concept, and this is abstract, and I think many times because we use so many manipulatives, if we only how do you say, if you only work with manipulatives and don't come back and teach the language, when it goes away from concrete and goes more to this abstract thinking, they don't have the tools, the language to anchor these new ideas. So, you know, always working explicitly with this.
Yes. So we just have 3 minutes left, so we can take some questions.
There's and we might have time just for one more question. This question is, are K-3 Common Core state standards more geared towards the explain, recount, discuss aspects of academic language?
K3 Common Core, if you, yeah, they're in math. In math?
Oh, it doesn't say, sorry.
So if it's English language arts, there is more explanation, recounts, and however, they are asked to write argument pieces that are called opinion at that level, and then it goes into claim in higher grades. But there are precursors to argument. There are opinion pieces in younger grades as well. And explanations are more cyclical explanations in younger grades and linear explanations. And cyclical are the ones like the life cycle of a butterfly, and linear are like how things work. And then explanations increase in complexity and language as they progress through grade levels. And recounts are information reports. I believe they begin in grade 1, and then personal narratives is another type of recount that starts right away in younger grades. So great questions. We just have a couple of minutes left.
And we want to thank everyone for hanging out with us and talking about academic language instead of having dinner.
There were two presenters, Mariana and Ruslana, but on the computer we logged in.
Someone asked the question that the name of the person talking never changed, and it was Dr. Ruslana Westerlund throughout the webinar.
Yeah.
It has to do with the fact that we are connected to only one computer.
I can do 2 accents too.
Yes,
I can pull off Mariana's
we apologize about that.
Great. Well, thank you for your comments and for your questions.
Yes, and thank you so much. We'd like to thank you both, Dr. Castro and Dr. Westerlund, for sharing your expertise with us all today. Thank you so much, as they said, for everybody who dialed on in the evening using some of your own time to learn a little bit together. We really appreciate it, and we hope that this has been helpful to you as part of your teaching practice and your professional work for English learners. We'd like to extend a final invitation to continue to connect and collaborate with us and your fellow educators on Education Connections. We will be posting an archive of this webinar there for you, as well as related resources, as they mentioned. And we had a great conversation on Twitter also, so if you go to #EdConnects, you'll actually see some teachers that had posted some examples of how they're applying this in their instruction. So I encourage you to check that out as well. Thank you so much, everyone. Let us know if you have any questions. You have our contact information there on your screen. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.